My parents gave me a gray badge at my sister's luxury wedding and whispered it meant no dinner for me. They still expected my $10,000 gift. In that moment, I realized love in my family was transactional, and I was about to break the contract in front of everyone watching. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments. And I will give you a heart. My name is Waverly Palmer, I'm 32, and I'm telling you this from my tiny studio in Queens where the radiator hisses like it's gossiping about me and the window view is a brick wall that has seen more of my life than my parents ever bothered to. Last week, my sister Miranda had a wedding so expensive it didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like a corporate merger with flowers. 200 grand. $15 million estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. Waiters gliding around like they were born holding silver trays. A string quartet playing like Heartbreak had a soundtrack. And right at the front entrance, before I even got a chance to pretend I belonged, I was handed a gray laminated badge that said "Limited Access Guest." Not my name, not bride sister, not family, just a label like I was a day pass at a gym. And my mother leaned in close, smiling that pageant smile she saves for rich people, and she whispered, "Sweet as poison. That means no plate for you, Waverly. No dinner, no seat, no reception, but somehow still a gift. Still the money. Still my contribution. Like I was good enough to fund the moment, but not good enough to sit at the table and eat like a human being." Now here's what you need to understand, because if you've ever been the extra child in your own family, you'll recognize this instantly. It's never one big betrayal. It's death by 1,000 polite cuts. It's not "we hate you." It's "oh, honey, you understand, right?" It's the way they look through you, around you, past you, like you're furniture that came with the house and nobody remembers buying. Growing up, I learned that love in my family came with a price tag and a ranking system. Miranda was the investment. I was the expense. Miranda got the bigger room, the better schools, the framed awards on the wall. I got hand-me-downs and we'll do something small and then nothing. There's a family photo from 2015 that still sits on my parents' mantle, my dad and mom and Miranda in front of a Christmas tree smiling like a postcard. I'm not in it. They cropped me out and told me the frame was too small. Think about how sick that is. Not, "We don't have a photo of all of us." No. They had the photo. They just edited me out like a typo. And I swallowed it because that's what overlooked kids do. You swallow things. You make excuses for people who don't deserve them. You become your own public relations team. They're stressed. They didn't mean it. They'll come around. And then you wake up one day, older, tired, and you realize you've been waiting for a train that isn't coming. The wedding invite arrived 6 months ago on thick cotton paper with gold embossing like the envelope itself had a trust fund. Miranda Palmer and Jonathan Whitmore III. Jonathan's family is old money, the kind where the last names sit straighter than the people. Greenwich, boards, charities, summer, used as a verb. My mother called me the minute the engagement happened, her voice shaking like she'd won something. Not because her daughter found love, but because my mother finally had a seat near the people she's been auditioning for her whole life. And me? I was added to the group chat like an afterthought, the way you add someone to a thread because it would look bad if you didn't. Miranda sent a photo of a 3-carat cushion-cut diamond on a rooftop in Manhattan. My mom replied in seconds, "My baby, happiest day of my life." Dad sent a thumbs up like he was reacting to a weather update. I typed "congratulations" and watched it sit there unliked, unacknowledged, like my message needed a gray badge too. But I decided, stupidly, painfully, that I was going to show up anyway. Because some part of me still believed in the fantasy that if I did enough, gave enough, proved enough, they'd finally treat me like I wasn't a glitch in their story. So, I did something that sounds insane to anyone who hasn't lived on a tight budget in New York. I saved $10,000. $10,000. 3 years of discipline. 3 years of bringing lunch to work while co-workers ordered takeout. 3 years of home coffee and no vacations, and wearing the same office clothes until the seams started whispering for mercy. I opened a separate savings account and labeled it Wedding Fund, because I needed a name to make the pain feel noble. I told myself I wasn't buying approval, I was giving love. But if you've ever been the neglected one, you know how blurry that line gets. The day I finally pulled that cashier's check, the teller asked if it was for a car. I laughed. I said, "A wedding." And she looked at me like, "Girl, you better be the bride." I went home, wrote a letter to Miranda, sealed it with shaking hands, and I took a picture of the check and the envelope and the letter like my instincts were screaming, "Document this." I didn't want to admit I was afraid, but I was. Because my mother called that same night, voice bright and artificial, and she said, "Have you bought your gift yet? You could just send the money to me, and I'll combine it with ours." Combine it. Translation. Let us take credit. Let us control the narrative. Let us turn your sacrifice into our generosity. I told her I'd rather hand it to Miranda myself, and the line went cold. Then she snapped, "Fine, whatever," and hung up without goodbye. That's when I should have listened to my body, because your body knows before your heart can handle it. My stomach dropped. My shoulders tightened. But I pushed it down because hope is a stubborn disease and I've carried it in my bloodstream for years. A month before the wedding, there was a bridal shower at the plaza. I wasn't asked to help plan it. I was seated at a corner table with random guests like I was there to make the room look full. My mother gave a speech about Miranda's brilliance, her career, her future, her perfect match, and she never once said my name, not even as a courtesy. Then, in the bathroom, I heard my mother whispering to my Aunt Harriet in a stall, and Harriet said, "Thank God you didn't make her a bridesmaid, can you imagine?" And my mother laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Jonathan's mother is very particular about appearances. We can't have anything distracting." Distracting. That's what I was. Not family. Not sister. A distraction. Like a stain on a white couch. I stood there staring at myself in the mirror with mascara smudged under one eye, and I realized something ugly. They weren't worried I'd ruin the day by causing drama. They were worried I'd ruin the day by existing too loudly in a space meant to impress people with money. Because my job, my apartment, my whole normal person life didn't match their new aesthetic. And when a family starts treating appearances like oxygen, the first thing they do is suffocate anyone who doesn't fit the picture. 1 week before the wedding, I found out I wasn't invited to the rehearsal dinner. My mother told me, "Numbers are strict." But Miranda's friend Jessica was invited, and she's not family, she's just shinier in their world. When I called it out, my mother said, "Don't make this difficult." And there it was again, the rigged game. If I ask for basic respect, I'm difficult. If I accept disrespect quietly, I'm mature. The truth is they wanted me compliant, not close. They wanted my silence, not my presence. 3 days before the wedding, my best friend Sophie called me late at night. She was the event planner hired for the wedding, and her voice was shaking like she was about to confess a crime. She told me she'd seen the seating chart, and my name had been crossed out with a pen, and next to it was a note. "Guest will receive limited access badge. No meal." She said it looked like my mother's handwriting. And when she texted me the photo, I just stared at the screen until my eyes burned. My mother didn't forget me. She planned me. She categorized me. She scheduled my humiliation like it was part of the floral budget. And that's the moment the last piece of denial in my brain finally snapped. Not loudly. Not dramatically. It clicked into place like a lock. Because when someone hurts you by accident, you can forgive. When someone hurts you with intention, you have a choice. You either keep begging them to stop, or you stop giving them access to your throat. Quick question before I take you into the wedding day itself, because I want you in this with me, and I want the comments to turn into a support group and a courtroom at the same time. Where are you watching from right now? Seriously, drop your city or country, because I already know I'm not the only one who's lived through family love that comes with terms and conditions. Now, wedding morning. June 14th. I woke up calm in a way that scared me. Not peaceful. Calculated. Like my nervous system had moved past panic and into strategy. I got dressed in a navy dress I'd bought on sale. Simple and elegant, because I refused to look messy in a place that tried to label me as disposable. I did my makeup neutral, mascara light, because I knew tears might come, and I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of watching me fall apart. I packed my clutch with the envelope and the screenshots and the photos Sophie sent, because if my family was going to rewrite the story, I was going to bring receipts. I called my Aunt Diane, the one person in my family who has always shown up like my existence mattered, and she said she'd be there and she'd stay near the gift table. She told me, "Whatever you decide, don't apologize." Then I took the train up and a taxi through Greenwich, past houses that looked like they were built to humble you on purpose. The Whitmore estate was ridiculous. Georgian architecture, white columns, hedges cut into shapes that scream, "We pay people to make nature behave." The driveway was lined with BMWs, Range Rovers, and people who looked like they belonged in a catalog called Generational Wealth. At the entrance, there was a registration table with badges stacked like hierarchy in plastic form. Guests in front of me got gold badges. Gold. Like they were chosen. Then I said my name, Waverly Palmer, and the staff member reached under the table and handed me gray. Gray like sidewalk. Gray like background. Gray like, "We hope you don't linger." He said, "This allows access to the ceremony only. Gold badges enter the reception." And before I could even breathe, my mother appeared in a pale pink gown and diamonds. She definitely wanted the Whitmores to notice, and she touched my elbow, like she owned my body, and she whispered, "Don't make a scene. That means no plate for you." And then, like she was explaining a seating chart and not dismantling her own daughter's dignity, she added, "There are important guests, Waverly. People who matter. Just stay for the ceremony. Leave your gift and go. Leave your gift and go." Like I was DoorDash. Like I was a delivery service for cash with feelings they didn't want to manage. I looked at her, and I saw the truth in high definition. She wasn't embarrassed about excluding me. She was only scared of being caught excluding me. And that's the difference between a mistake and a betrayal. I nodded. I smiled. I played nice. I let her believe I was still the old version of me, the one who swallows pain and calls it maturity. Then I walked to the back row of the ceremony area because of course my chair was different, cheaper, folding, while the front rows had cushioned seats. The symbolism wasn't subtle. It was basically screaming. Miranda came out in a Vera Wang gown, $20,000 worth of fabric and attention. She looked gorgeous, and I mean that sincerely, but beauty doesn't cancel cruelty, it just decorates it. The vows happened, the applause happened. My mother cried photogenic tears with her monogrammed handkerchief, and when the photographer called for any other family, my mother shook her head and said, "No, we're all here." And that sentence right there, that lie, that casual erasure, it did something to me. Because I realized they didn't just exclude me from the reception. They excluded me from the idea of family itself. They were willing to stand in public and say I didn't exist. And after the ceremony, everyone drifted toward the reception, tent glowing warm and golden like a promise I wasn't allowed to touch. I stood at the edge of the garden watching them disappear into it, and for a split second, I considered leaving quietly with my envelope and never speaking to any of them again. That would have been clean. That would have been easy. That would have been the version of me they count on. But then I thought about 3 years of sacrifice sitting inside that envelope. I thought about my mother trying to take credit for my gift. I thought about distracting. I thought about the cropped photo. And I realized something that might help someone watching this. If you keep rewarding disrespect with generosity, all you do is teach people that humiliating you is profitable. And I wasn't going to make my humiliation profitable. I walked toward the gift table, calm, steady, like I wasn't about to light a match in a room full of gas. I could see the staff checking badges at the tent entrance. I could see guests laughing inside. I could see my father's profile near the head table, his posture telling me he'd once again chosen silence over protection. Aunt Diane stood in the distance near a trellis, watching me like a guardian angel who also knows where to hide a body if needed. I reached the gift table and saw the mountain of wrapped boxes and luxury bags and calligraphy cards, and then I saw it, the white envelope with my handwriting slightly tucked under a bigger gift, like even my gift was being covered. I slid it into my clutch in one smooth motion. Not dramatic, not frantic, just reclaiming what was mine. And that's when I heard my mother's heels clicking behind me and her voice, sharp with panic. "Waverly, what are you doing?" I turned, smiled, and in that moment, I could feel the attention starting to shift. Not fully yet, but enough. Because when the invisible person finally moves, everyone notices the air change. My mother stepped closer, still smiling for the crowd, and hissed through her teeth, "Put it back right now." And I kept my voice calm, almost polite, because I wanted her to be the one who looked unhinged, not me. I said, "You told me to leave my gift and go. I'm just choosing the go part." Her smile twitched. Her eyes flashed. And right then, I noticed something that made my stomach go cold for a completely different reason. Someone important was walking toward us from the tent entrance, someone with posture and pearls, and the kind of face that doesn't ask twice. Jonathan's mother, Eleanor Whitmore. And the way she looked at my gray badge, then at my mother's frozen smile, told me this was about to stop being a private family cruelty and start becoming a public social disaster. And I'm going to be honest with you, I didn't plan the next moment, but I knew one thing for sure. If Eleanor asked a question, my mother was going to have to answer it in front of everyone she'd been trying to impress, and my sister's perfect day was about to collide with the truth my family buried for 32 years. Eleanor Whitmore stopped about 3 feet away from us, close enough that I could smell her perfume, something expensive and restrained, the kind that doesn't announce itself but expects to be noticed, and she tilted her head slightly as her eyes moved from my gray badge to my clutch to my mother's hand, hovering like it wanted to snatch something back, and in that pause I could practically hear the gears in her mind turning. Because women like Eleanor don't miss details, they collect them, they store them, they weaponize them later if needed, and she smiled politely and said, "Is everything all right here?" In that calm tone that sounds gentle but is actually a test, and my mother laughed too quickly and said, "Oh yes, just a little family mix-up." And the word mix-up hung there like a bad joke because nothing about this was accidental. Nothing about this was a misunderstanding. This was choreography. And Eleanor's eyes flicked back to me and she said, "And you are?" And for half a second my mother hesitated, just a fraction, and in that hesitation was 32 years of truth. Because if she'd been proud of me, the answer would have come instantly, but instead she said, "This is Waverly. Not daughter, not sister of the bride, just a name." And Eleanor nodded slowly and said, "And your badge says limited access." And that was the moment the ground shifted, because now it wasn't just my humiliation. It was a question of optics, and my mother stiffened and said, "It's just a seating issue." We had more guests than expected, and Eleanor smiled again, thinner this time, and said, "Interesting, because I was under the impression that immediate family was seated before friends." And my mother opened her mouth and closed it like a fish realizing the water's gone. And I stood there listening to my own heartbeat and thinking how surreal it was that the first person to notice something was wrong wasn't my parents or my sister. It was a woman who had known me for less than 5 minutes. And that realization hurt in a quiet way that almost knocked the breath out of me, because it confirmed something I'd suspected for years, that strangers had given me more basic courtesy than my own family ever had. And Eleanor turned fully toward me then and said, "You're Miranda's sister?" And I nodded and said, "Yes." And she asked, "And you're not attending the reception?" And I didn't look at my mother when I answered. I looked directly at Eleanor and said, "No, ma'am." And I could feel my mother's nails digging into her champagne flute as she said, "Waverly understands, don't you?" And there it was again, that demand disguised as a question, the expectation that I'd smooth it over, that I'd protect the image at my own expense, and something inside me, something old and tired and done, finally stood up straight, and I said, "I understand exactly what's happening." And Eleanor's eyebrow lifted just slightly, and she said, "Would you like to explain?" And the air went electric, because this was the fork in the road, the moment where I could back down and keep playing the role I'd been assigned, or I could say out loud what had been whispered and implied my entire life. And I thought about all the times I'd been told not to make things awkward, not to rock the boat, not to embarrass anyone, and I realized that the boat had been rocking for years, just not for them, only for me. So I took a breath and said, "I was invited to the ceremony, but excluded from the rehearsal dinner and the reception, despite being the bride's sister." And Eleanor's gaze snapped back to my mother, and she said, "Is that accurate?" And my mother started talking fast, words tumbling over each other. "It's not personal, Eleanor. You know how these things are. Jonathan's parents have so many obligations, so many important people, and Waverly is very understanding. And Eleanor cut her off gently but firmly and said, "Understanding of what? Exactly?" And my mother faltered, because there is no elegant way to say we didn't think she was important enough to feed. And that's when Miranda appeared, her dress still perfect, her smile already strained, and she said, "What's going on?" And my mother turned toward her like a lifeline and said, "Nothing, darling, just a small misunderstanding." And Miranda's eyes flicked to my badge and then to my face, and for a split second I saw something like guilt there. But it passed quickly, replaced by irritation, because guilt requires courage and irritation is easier. And she said, "Waverly, why are you making this a thing?" And that question hit harder than anything else because it framed me as the problem, not the behavior, not the exclusion, not the planning that went into sidelining me, but my reaction to it. And that's gaslighting in its cleanest form, making the injured party responsible for the injury. And I felt the heat rise in my chest and I said, "I'm not making anything a thing. I was given a badge that says I'm not allowed to eat or attend the reception." And Eleanor's eyes sharpened and she said, "No meal?" And Miranda looked at my mother and said, "Mom?" And my mother's face went pale and she said, "It was just logistics." And Eleanor shook her head slowly and said, "Logistics don't usually include denying immediate family a seat at the table." And there was a murmur now, quiet but unmistakable. Nearby guests sensing tension, turning their heads, curiosity spreading like a ripple in water. And my mother leaned closer to me and whispered, "Please, not here." And for a moment I almost laughed, because she didn't say "I'm sorry" or "I didn't realize" or "this was wrong." She said "not here, not in front of these people, not where it could affect how she was seen." And I realized that if this conversation had stayed private, nothing would ever change, because shame only works when there's an audience. And Eleanor was the wrong audience to lie to, and she said, "Patricia, I'd like to understand why your daughter is wearing a limited access badge at her sister's wedding." And my mother opened her mouth again, and nothing came out, and the silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. And in that silence, I thought about something I want you to think about too, if you're watching this and nodding along, because this pattern is everywhere. Families that reward success with love and punish normalcy with neglect. Parents who act like referees, but secretly rig the game, and the child who doesn't fit the narrative ends up paying for it quietly for years. And I realized that silence was my family's favorite tool, because silence lets things continue exactly as they are, and I was done giving it that power, so I said, "I was also asked to send my gift money early, so it could be combined with my parents' gift." And my mother hissed my name like a warning, but Eleanor's eyes widened just a fraction, and she said, "Combined?" And I nodded and said, $10,000. And this time the murmur wasn't subtle, it was audible, heads turning, whispers starting, because even in a room full of wealth, $10,000 is still a statement. And Miranda stared at me and said, "You didn't tell me that." And I said, "No, you were busy." And that stung her. I could tell, because it was true, and Eleanor's expression had gone from polite curiosity to something colder, evaluative, and she said, "So let me see if I understand. You were excluded from events, denied a seat and a meal, but still expected to contribute financially." And my mother tried to interrupt, but Eleanor held up a hand and continued, "That doesn't align with how we do things." And my mother's shoulders sagged slightly, because she knew, in that moment, that the image she'd been so carefully curating was cracking, and Miranda said, "This is getting blown out of proportion." And I looked at her and thought how easy it must be to believe that when you're always the one being accommodated, and I said, "It feels proportionate when you're the one being excluded." And Eleanor nodded once, sharply, and said, "I agree." And that was it. That was the moment the power shifted, because someone with status had acknowledged what I'd been living with for decades, and my mother looked like she might cry, but not out of remorse, out of panic, and she said, "We can fix this, Waverly, you can come to the reception." And I almost smiled, because now that the exclusion had consequences, suddenly there was room, suddenly there was flexibility, suddenly logistics weren't so rigid. And I realized something crucial, something I want you to hear clearly, because it might save you years of self-doubt. If respect only appears when there's pressure, it was never respect to begin with. It was convenience. And I said, "No, calmly, and my mother blinked and said, "What?" And I said, "I'm not interested in a last-minute seat offered to save face," and Miranda said, "You're being dramatic," and I felt a strange calm settle over me, because the decision had already been made somewhere deep inside. And I said, "I'm being honest." And Eleanor watched me closely then and said, "What would you like to do?" And that question, simple as it was, felt revolutionary, because no one in my family had ever asked me that. They'd only told me what I should do, what I should accept, what I should ignore, and I looked at the reception tent glowing behind them, at the gift table nearby, at my clutch, and I said, "I'd like to take my gift back and leave." And my mother gasped like I'd threatened arson and said, "You can't do that." And Eleanor tilted her head and said, "Why not?" And my mother sputtered, "Because it's already been given." And I shook my head and said, "It hasn't been opened or deposited." And Eleanor nodded thoughtfully and said, "Then it's still hers." And the silence that followed was heavy and public and impossible to ignore. And Miranda's face flushed red and she said, "You're ruining my wedding." And I looked at her and thought about all the times my existence had been inconvenient for her narrative, and I said, "I didn't ruin anything. I just stopped pretending." And that was the moment I felt something break free inside me. Not anger, not sadness, but a kind of release, like setting down a weight I'd been carrying so long I forgot it wasn't part of my body. And Eleanor stepped back slightly and said, "I think we all need a moment." And she looked at my mother and said, "We'll talk later." And the implication in her voice was unmistakable. And my mother nodded numbly, and Miranda looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time and didn't like what she saw, because it wasn't compliant, it wasn't apologetic, it wasn't small. And I turned away from them then and walked toward the gift table, my legs steady, my hands shaking just slightly, because courage doesn't mean you're not scared, it means you move anyway. And as I reached for my envelope, I felt eyes on me, curiosity, judgment, sympathy, maybe even respect. And I realized that no matter what happened next, something fundamental had already changed. Because the truth was out in the open, and once truth is visible, it can't be put back in the box. And as my fingers closed around that envelope, I knew the next thing that happened was going to define the relationship I had with my family from that moment on. Because there's a point in every story like this where you either step back into the role you've been assigned or you walk forward into something uncertain but honest. And I was done playing my part, even if it meant burning the script. And what happened when I turned back around with that envelope in my hand is something my family still talks about in whispers, because it forced everyone there to confront a question they'd been avoiding for years. And that question was simple but dangerous. Who gets to decide who matters, and what happens when the person you've been ignoring finally decides they do? The moment my fingers closed around the envelope, I felt a strange stillness settle over me. Not calm exactly, more like the eye of a storm, that unnatural quiet right before something irreversible happens, and I became acutely aware of everything at once. The weight of the paper in my clutch, the heat of the afternoon sun on the back of my neck, the low murmur of guests pretending not to stare while absolutely staring, and my mother's sharp intake of breath behind me like she'd just realized a door had slammed shut somewhere she couldn't reach anymore. And I turned slowly because I wanted them to see my face when I did it, not angry, not crying, not shaking, but clear. And clarity is terrifying to people who rely on confusion to stay in control. And Miranda looked at me like she didn't recognize me, like I'd violated some unspoken family rule by not shrinking on cue, and she said my name again, softer this time, warning disguised as concern, "Waverly, please," and I almost laughed. Because please had never been used on me before unless it was followed by something I was expected to sacrifice, and I realized in that moment that my entire role in this family had been built on quiet compliance, on being the reasonable one, the flexible one, the one who didn't need much. And the second I stepped outside that role, everything started to wobble. Because systems like this only work when one person keeps absorbing the cost, and Eleanor Whitmore was watching closely now, not intervening, not rescuing, just observing. And I understood why people like her end up with power, because they don't rush to smooth things over. They let people reveal themselves, and my mother did exactly that when she stepped closer and hissed, "You're embarrassing us." And I looked at her and thought about how fascinating it was that embarrassment mattered more to her than the fact that she'd excluded her own daughter from a meal. And I said quietly, "I didn't embarrass anyone, I told the truth." And that word hit the space between us like a dropped plate. Because truth is the one thing families like mine never prepare for. They prepare for appearances, for narratives, for damage control, but not for honesty spoken out loud in front of witnesses. And my father finally appeared then, hovering at the edge of the circle like he always did, present enough to claim innocence later, distant enough to avoid responsibility. And he said, "Let's all calm down," which is what people say when they benefit from things staying exactly as they are. And I looked at him and felt something snap, not rage, not grief, but the last thread of hope, the one that still believed he might step in someday. And I said, "Dad, when exactly was I supposed to calm down? Before or after you let this happen?" And his mouth opened and closed and nothing came out, because silence has always been his favorite language. And Miranda crossed her arms and said, "You're acting like we did this to hurt you." And I almost admired the audacity of it, the way she reframed the situation so effortlessly. Like pain only counts if it's intentional, like neglect and exclusion don't wound just as deeply. And I said, "It doesn't matter why you did it. It matters that you did it and didn't stop it." And Eleanor nodded once, sharply, and I could feel the balance of the moment shifting away from my parents, because social power doesn't protect you when your behavior violates basic decency. And my mother's voice cracked as she said, "I did everything for this family." And that was the closest she ever came to saying what she really meant. I did everything for the version of this family that makes me look good. And I thought about all the invisible labor I'd done for years, the emotional flexibility, the understanding, the forgiveness that was never reciprocated. And I realized something I want you to sit with if this story feels familiar. Love that requires you to erase yourself is not love. It's control dressed up as obligation. And Eleanor finally spoke again, her tone cool and precise. "Patricia, this is not how we treat family." And my mother flinched, like she'd been slapped, because Eleanor's disapproval carried weight, the kind my pain never had. And Miranda looked panicked now, eyes darting between her new mother-in-law and me, calculating losses, and she said, "Fine. Okay, you can stay. We'll add a chair. We'll fix it." And that was the moment I knew I couldn't stay even if I wanted to, because once respect only shows up as a negotiation tactic, it's already too late. And I shook my head and said, "No," and the simplicity of it stunned them, more than shouting ever could. And my mother whispered, "You're really going to do this?" And I met her eyes and said, "I'm really going to stop doing this." And the difference mattered, and I turned away from them again, envelope secure in my hand, and started walking toward the exit path, heels sinking slightly into the gravel, heart pounding hard enough that I could hear it in my ears. And behind me voices rose, confusion spreading as more guests realized something was wrong. And I heard my name. Again, sharper now, desperate, but I didn't turn around, because turning around is how you get pulled back into the gravity of people who only value you when you're useful. And Aunt Diane appeared at my side without a word, matching my pace, her presence steady and grounding. And as we walked, I felt something unexpected bloom beneath the adrenaline, relief, raw and unfamiliar, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding me. And as we reached the edge of the estate, I glanced back once and saw my family standing there in disarray, their perfect day fractured by a truth they'd hoped would stay buried. And I realized that the real consequences of what I'd done hadn't even begun yet, because walking away is loud in the moment. But what happens afterward is where the real reckoning lies, the calls, the justifications, the attempts to rewrite history, the pressure to forgive for the sake of comfort. And as I stepped into the waiting car, heart still racing, I knew with absolute certainty that the next phase of this story wasn't about a wedding anymore. It was about what happens when the person who's always been treated as optional finally makes themselves unavailable. And that's when families like mine reveal who they really are. The car door closed with a dull, final thud that echoed louder in my chest than in the quiet Connecticut air. And as we pulled away from the estate, I felt something strange happen inside me. Not relief yet, not peace, but the sudden absence of a pressure I hadn't realized I'd been carrying my entire life. Like someone had finally taken their foot off my chest, and I could breathe deeply for the first time without permission. And Aunt Diane sat beside me without speaking, because some moments don't need commentary, they need witness. And the farther we got from the white columns and manicured hedges, the clearer my thoughts became, not racing anymore, just lining themselves up like dominoes. each realization knocking into the next, because walking away wasn't the end of the story, it was the trigger, and families like mine don't respond to loss of control with reflection, they respond with escalation. And my phone confirmed that within minutes, vibrating insistently in my clutch. Like it was offended by my silence, my mother's name lighting up the screen again and again, followed by Miranda, followed by unknown numbers I recognized as relatives who never remembered my birthday but suddenly had opinions, and I turned the phone face down without answering because I needed one thing more than closure in that moment: space. And the car ride to the station stretched on while my nervous system slowly caught up with what my mind had already decided, that I was done negotiating my worth, done performing gratitude for crumbs, done apologizing for existing in a way that didn't flatter anyone else's image. And Aunt Diane finally spoke when we were almost there, her voice calm but firm, and she said, "You did exactly what you needed to do, even if it doesn't feel like it yet." And I nodded because somewhere deep down I knew she was right. But knowing something intellectually and surviving the emotional fallout are two very different things, and the fallout came faster than I expected, because the moment I stepped onto the train platform and the doors slid shut behind us, my phone exploded again, this time with voicemails stacking up so quickly the counter couldn't keep up, and I didn't listen to them yet, but I could imagine them perfectly. My mother crying first, then pivoting to anger, then bargaining. My father trying to sound reasonable while asking me to fix what he'd allowed to break. Miranda oscillating between fury and desperation because golden children don't cope well when the hierarchy shifts, and I thought about something important that I want you to think about too if you've ever been in this position. The moment you stop absorbing dysfunction, the system doesn't collapse quietly, it thrashes, and the train ride back felt surreal, like I was floating between two versions of myself. The one who had always hoped today would finally be different, and the one who now understood that different doesn't come from trying harder, it comes from choosing differently. And by the time I reached my apartment, the small studio with the brick wall view that had witnessed so many silent nights of self-doubt, the adrenaline had worn off and left exhaustion in its place, heavy and bone-deep, and I sat on the edge of my bed still wearing the dress I'd chosen so carefully, shoes kicked off, clutch resting beside me like evidence from a trial that had finally concluded. And that's when I listened to the first voicemail, my mother's voice, breaking through the speaker with a sob that might have moved me once. "Waverly, please call me. You've humiliated us. You've humiliated your sister. Do you have any idea what you've done?" And I paused the message there because that sentence told me everything I needed to know. Not "you've hurt us," not "we're sorry," but "you've humiliated us." Because in her mind, the greatest crime wasn't cruelty, it was exposure. And I didn't delete the message, I saved it because I was done gaslighting myself into believing I imagined things. And the next voicemail was my father's, quieter, heavier. "Waverly, your mother is beside herself. This didn't have to go this far. We could have talked privately." And I laughed out loud, a short, bitter sound that surprised even me. Because privately is where truth goes to die in families like mine. Privately is where things get smoothed over and forgotten until the next incident, and the next, and the next, and I realized something that made my chest tighten. They didn't want resolution. They wanted containment, and Miranda's message was the one that finally cracked the numbness, her voice sharp and shaking. "You always do this. You always make everything about you. Today was my day and you ruined it." And there it was, the script she'd been handed and never questioned. That my pain was an inconvenience. That my reaction was the problem, not the cause. And I sat there listening to her cry about the embarrassment, about Jonathan's parents, about Eleanor's silence afterward. And I thought about how easily she could have stopped all of this with one sentence at the entrance, one moment of solidarity, and how she chose not to because standing with me would have cost her something. And that's when the exhaustion turned into something else, resolve, cold and steady, and I did something I'd never done before. I turned my phone off completely, not silent, not do not disturb, off, because I needed to hear my own thoughts without theirs drowning them out. And the next morning I woke up to sunlight filtering through the thin curtains and a stillness that felt unfamiliar. Like the calm after a storm where the damage hasn't been assessed yet. And over coffee, I replayed the day again, not to torture myself, but to see it clearly. And clarity is dangerous because once you have it, you can't unsee it. And what I saw was a pattern that had nothing to do with weddings and everything to do with power. My parents had spent decades investing in the child who reflected best on them and neglecting the one who didn't, not because I was lesser, but because I was inconvenient, and that realization hurt. But it also freed me from one of the most destructive lies we tell ourselves, that if we just explain better, love harder, give more, they'll change. And I want to ask you something right now, and answer it honestly, not for me, but for yourself. How many times have you been asked to be understanding while no one tried to understand you? How many times have you been told to keep the peace while your own peace was being shredded? And how many moments have you swallowed your pain because speaking it would have made other people uncomfortable? And if this story is hitting close to home, I want you to pause for a second and tell me where you're watching from, not because I need it, but because it grounds you back in yourself. It reminds you that you're here, that you exist outside of the roles people assign you. And as the day unfolded, the consequences began to surface, not dramatically, but quietly, in ways that mattered more. A text from Sophie saying Eleanor had requested a private meeting with Jonathan and Miranda. Another from Aunt Diane saying my mother had called her in a rage, accusing her of betrayal. And that accusation made me smile sadly, because when you stop protecting a lie, people who depend on it feel attacked. And by evening my phone was back on and the messages resumed. But something had changed, their tone. Less commanding, more uncertain. Because the leverage they'd always relied on, my compliance, was gone. And my father sent a message that stopped me cold. I didn't protect you, and I should have. And I stared at those words for a long time, because acknowledgement doesn't erase damage, but it does mark a turning point. And I didn't reply yet, because this part mattered. Not rushing back into the familiar pattern of smoothing things over. And that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I understood something that felt both devastating and empowering. The hardest part wasn't walking away from the wedding. It was accepting that the version of my family I'd been fighting for never actually existed. And the next phase of the story wasn't about whether they'd apologize or change. It was about what they would do when they realized guilt wasn't enough to pull me back. And that's when things would get truly ugly, because when control fails, manipulation escalates, and I could feel it coming, the next move, the next attempt to reassert the old hierarchy, and I knew with certainty that the confrontation wasn't over, it was just beginning. And the next time we spoke, the masks would come off completely. The next wave didn't arrive as shouting or apologies or dramatic ultimatums. It arrived as strategy, quiet at first, almost polite. And that's how I knew it was real, because my family only softened their tone when they wanted something back. And by the second morning after the wedding, my inbox looked like a corporate negotiation disguised as concern. Messages spaced carefully instead of frantically. Language scrubbed of blame and loaded with implication. My mother opening with "I've been doing a lot of thinking," my father following with "let's all take a breath and talk like adults," Miranda sending a single sentence that felt rehearsed, "We need to clear the air before things get worse." And I remember sitting at my small kitchen table staring at those words and realizing that none of them were actually about me, not my feelings, not my experience. Not the humiliation of being labeled limited access at my own sister's wedding. They were about damage control, about reputation, about restoring a familiar order that had been disrupted in front of the wrong audience. And the most dangerous thing about families like mine is that they don't see you as a person, they see you as a role. And when you step out of it, they rush to put you back before anyone notices the script is flawed. And that realization hardened something inside me, because I'd spent my entire life assuming malice when the real issue was entitlement. They felt entitled to my silence, entitled to my generosity, entitled to my forgiveness. And now they were discovering what happens when entitlement meets a boundary, and it terrified them because boundaries expose truths they've been avoiding. And I decided something important that morning. I would not meet them together. Not yet. Not while they could triangulate and overwhelm me. So I replied to my father only one sentence: "We can talk, but not as a group." And the pause that followed was long enough to tell me that I'd just disrupted another unspoken rule. And when he finally responded, it was with a suggestion to meet for coffee near my apartment, neutral territory, public, controlled. And I agreed, because there's power in being willing to sit at the table when you're no longer starving. And as I walked to the cafe that afternoon, I felt the old nerves creeping back, the instinct to rehearse explanations, to soften my tone, to preemptively apologize for existing loudly. And I stopped myself on the sidewalk and took a breath, because that instinct had cost me years of dignity. And when I walked in and saw my father already seated, shoulders hunched, coffee untouched, I felt a flicker of something unexpected, not pity, but clarity. He looked smaller without my mother beside him, less certain, like a man who'd spent decades outsourcing emotional labor and was now being asked to show up alone, and we exchanged brief greetings before sitting down, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence stretching until it felt intentional, and then he said, "I should have stopped this a long time ago," and I watched his eyes as he said it, not for tears, not for guilt, but for ownership, and what I saw was hesitation, like he was still deciding how much truth he could afford, and I didn't rush him, because silence can be a mirror, and eventually he continued, "Your mother has always been very focused on appearances, you know that," and there it was, the first deflection dressed as context. And I leaned back and said calmly, "Dad, I didn't ask why she did it, I asked why you let it happen," and that question landed differently, heavier, because it removed his shield. And he exhaled slowly and said something that stuck with me. I didn't think it was my place, and I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was tragically familiar. The mantra of passive harm. Not my place, not my role, not my responsibility, and I told him the truth then, quietly but clearly. When you choose comfort over protection, you're choosing a side, and he flinched. Because people like him believe neutrality is kindness, and they hate being shown the cost of it. And we talked for nearly an hour, not circling the wedding itself, but the years leading up to it, the graduations missed, the achievements minimized, the constant comparison that was never explicit but always present. And he admitted something that surprised me, that he'd noticed the imbalance years ago but convinced himself it would even out eventually because acknowledging it would have required conflict. And conflict was something he'd spent his life avoiding. And I realized then that my parents' betrayal didn't come from a single decision. It came from 1,000 small avoidances, each one easier than the last. And before we left, I said something I hadn't planned, something that came from a place I didn't know I'd reached yet. "I'm not asking you to choose between us. I'm asking you to choose to see me." And he nodded, slowly, like someone hearing a foreign language they were trying to translate. And when we parted, there was no resolution, no hug, no promise of change, just an uneasy understanding that the old dynamic couldn't be restored without my consent, and that was new territory for all of us. And the fallout didn't stop there, because once one conversation happens, the others demand their turn, and that evening Miranda showed up at my apartment unannounced, standing in the hallway in leggings and an oversized sweatshirt that felt intentionally casual, like she was trying to signal vulnerability without surrendering control, and I let her in because avoidance would only feed the narrative she'd already built. And we sat across from each other on opposite ends of my couch, the space between us heavy with things unsaid, and she started where I expected. I didn't know about the badge until the day of, and I held her gaze and said, "But you knew I wasn't invited to the rehearsal dinner." And she hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything, because when people lie smoothly, it's because they've rehearsed it, and when they hesitate, it's because they're choosing how much truth to reveal. And she admitted then that she'd agreed to it, because Jonathan's mother had asked about seating and optics, and my mother had suggested a solution, and Miranda had gone along with it, because it seemed easier than pushing back, and I felt a familiar heat rise in my chest, but I kept my voice steady as I said, "Easier for who?" And she didn't answer immediately. And in that pause, I saw the cost of being the golden child, the way privilege dulls empathy, the way being favored makes injustice invisible until it threatens you. And she said quietly, "I didn't think it would hurt you this much." And I replied without anger, "That's because you've never had to think about me that way." And the truth of that hung between us. And she cried then, not elegantly, not strategically, but messily. And part of me softened despite myself, because siblings can be both perpetrators and victims of the same system, and I told her something that mattered. "I'm not your safety net anymore." And her eyes snapped up, panic flashing across her face, because loss of access feels like abandonment to people who've never had to earn it. And she asked what that meant, and I explained slowly, carefully, that it meant I would no longer absorb discomfort to preserve her comfort, that I would no longer be the quiet one so she could shine, that our relationship would have to be rebuilt from equal ground or not at all. And she asked if that meant I was cutting them off. And I said no, but I'm done chasing. And that distinction is important, because cutting off is an act of aggression, but stepping back is an act of self-preservation. And when she left that night, there was no hug, just a mutual understanding that something irreversible had occurred. And as I closed the door behind her, I felt the weight of grief settle in, not for what was lost, but for what never truly existed, and I want to pause here and ask you something, because stories like this don't live in isolation. Where are you watching from right now? And what part of this feels uncomfortably familiar? And as the days passed, the ripple effects became impossible to ignore. Extended family members reaching out with carefully worded messages that pretended neutrality while clearly aligning with one side. Invitations quietly rescinded. Group chats going silent, because when you disrupt a hierarchy, people have to decide where they stand, and silence is a decision. And the most unsettling part was how calm I felt through it all. Not numb, but anchored, like my nervous system had finally accepted that the danger wasn't in losing them, it was in losing myself again. And that calm scared them more than any outburst ever could, because calm means you're not seeking approval anymore, and approval is the currency they've always used. And just when I thought the worst had passed, the final escalation arrived, not from my parents or my sister, but from Eleanor Whitmore herself, an email delivered with pristine grammar and unmistakable authority, requesting a private conversation. And as I read it, my stomach dropped, because this wasn't about family anymore. This was about exposure, about consequences beyond the living room. And I understood instantly that whatever she wanted to say would change the trajectory of everything, because people like her don't reach out unless they intend to intervene. And the question wasn't whether I was ready to hear it. The question was whether my parents were ready for what she was about to do, because the reckoning they feared most was no longer in my hands. The email from Eleanor Whitmore didn't ask, it summoned, written in that polite, lethal tone reserved for people who are used to being obeyed without raising their voice. And I remember reading it twice to make sure I hadn't imagined the subtext, because nowhere did she accuse. Nowhere did she threaten, but every word carried weight. And I knew instantly that whatever conversation she wanted wasn't about smoothing things over, it was about consequences. And that scared me more than my parents' anger ever could, because anger you can predict, but principled disappointment from someone with power moves quietly and permanently. So I agreed to meet her at a private club in Manhattan 2 days later, the kind of place you don't walk into by accident. And as I stood outside, waiting for the doorman to wave me through, I had this surreal thought that my mother would have killed to be standing where I was, not because of status exactly, but because access had always been her obsession. And here I was gaining it not through marriage or manipulation, but through refusal, and that irony wasn't lost on me. And when Eleanor arrived, she didn't waste time with pleasantries. She shook my hand firmly, gestured for us to sit, and said the words that reframed everything. I owe you an apology, and that alone would have been enough to disarm me, because I wasn't prepared for accountability from someone who didn't actually wrong me. But she continued, explaining that she'd witnessed many family dynamics in her life, but few as calculated as what had happened at the wedding, and she was explicit. She called it calculated, and she told me she'd spent the past week reassessing her opinion of the Palmer family, particularly my mother, and I sat there stunned, as she described, confronting Patricia privately after I left, not with raised voices, but with pointed questions that left no room for denial, asking why a daughter was good enough to fund a celebration but not attend it, why optics mattered more than integrity. And she said my mother's responses confirmed something she'd suspected, that the exclusion wasn't a mistake, it was strategy. And then Eleanor said something that sent a chill through me. I don't associate with people who treat family as disposable, and that sentence carried more force than any threat, because it wasn't emotional, it was operational. And she explained that she and her husband were reconsidering several commitments tied to the Palmer name, introductions that would no longer be made, invitations that would quietly stop arriving. And she wasn't doing this as revenge, she said, but as alignment. Because how people behave when they think no one important is watching tells you everything you need to know. And suddenly I understood why my mother had been unraveling all week. This wasn't just embarrassment, it was collapse. And Eleanor looked at me then with something that almost resembled respect and said, "You did something very difficult. You disrupted a narrative that benefited many people at your expense, and I want you to know that I won't be complicit in restoring it." And for the first time since the wedding, I felt seen by someone who had no obligation to see me. And before we parted, she offered something unexpected. Not money, not connections, but validation, telling me that I had every right to protect myself and that refusing to play along wasn't cruelty, it was clarity. And as I left that club and stepped back into the noise of the city, I realized the story had shifted. This was no longer about me reclaiming dignity quietly. It was about the consequences of my family's choices playing out in spaces they cared about deeply, and that realization brought a strange mix of relief and dread because I knew what was coming next, the backlash, and it didn't take long. My phone lit up that evening with messages that no longer tried to sound reasonable. My mother accusing me of poisoning relationships, my father pleading for me to intervene, Miranda oscillating between rage and panic because Eleanor Whitmore had weight, and her withdrawal was being felt immediately. And the most telling message came from my mother, who wrote, "I hope you're happy. You've ruined everything we worked for," and I stared at that sentence for a long time because it revealed the truth she'd never admit out loud, that everything she'd worked for hadn't included me. Not really, I'd been collateral, and I typed a response I never sent, something sharp and final, but instead I put the phone down and went for a walk because reacting would only pull me back into the emotional quicksand I'd just escaped. And as I walked, I thought about how families like mine operate on invisible contracts, unspoken agreements that you'll accept crumbs in exchange for belonging, that you'll stay small so others can feel large, and breaking that contract feels like betrayal to those who benefit from it. And that's what they were experiencing now, not grief, not remorse, but loss of control. And over the next week, the fallout intensified. Extended relatives calling with rehearsed concern. Phrases like family is everything and you only get one mother tossed around like moral weapons. And I noticed something fascinating, no. One asked how I felt. They asked why I'd embarrassed my parents, why I couldn't have handled it privately. And that's when it clicked that privacy is often demanded to protect abusers, not victims, because public accountability disrupts comfort. And I started declining calls politely, firmly, not engaging in debates that assumed my silence was the default. And in the middle of all this, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from right now? And have you ever been told to keep the peace at your own expense? Because I know I'm not alone in this. And just when I thought the storm had peaked, my father showed up at my door unannounced one evening, looking older than I remembered, shoulders slumped, eyes tired. And I let him in because part of me still needed closure. And he didn't sit down right away. He stood in the doorway, twisting his hands, and said, "Your mother is spiraling." And I waited, because that wasn't my responsibility. And he went on, explaining that invitations had been rescinded, that phone calls weren't being returned, that my mother felt humiliated and betrayed. And he looked at me then and said something that surprised me. "She doesn't understand why you didn't protect her." And I felt something snap into focus. This wasn't about love. It was about roles. She believed I existed to shield her from consequences. And I told him gently but firmly, "Dad, I'm not her buffer anymore." And he nodded slowly, like someone finally accepting a diagnosis they'd been avoiding. And he asked if I'd consider speaking to Eleanor, smoothing things over, and I said no without hesitation, because doing so would mean undoing everything I'd just claimed. And for the first time, he didn't argue. He just looked defeated, and before he left, he said quietly, "I think I finally understand how much we asked you to carry," and I didn't know if that was growth or regret. But either way, it came too late to change what had already shifted, and as I closed the door behind him, I felt a profound sense of finality. Not dramatic, not explosive, just settled, like a door closing gently but permanently. And over the following days, the noise faded, messages slowed. The urgency dissipated as my family adjusted to the new reality. And in that quiet, I began to notice something else, the absence of constant tension, the freedom of not anticipating the next slight, the relief of no longer negotiating my worth. And I realized that the most radical outcome of all this wasn't their discomfort, it was my peace. And that peace felt dangerous to people who thrived on control, and I knew instinctively that the next move wouldn't come from them. It would come from me, because boundaries aren't static. They're choices you make again and again. And the real reckoning wasn't over yet. It was just shifting inward, toward a decision that would determine whether this chapter ended in distance or transformation. And that decision would force me to confront a question I'd avoided my entire life. Not whether they could change, but whether I still wanted them to. The decision I kept circling but refusing to name finally landed one quiet morning when nothing dramatic happened at all. No phone calls, no messages, no crises to react to, just silence. And that silence was louder than any confrontation because it forced me to sit with myself without the familiar distraction of managing other people's emotions. And I realized how much of my identity had been shaped around anticipation. Reading rooms, preemptively adjusting, staying 2 steps ahead so no one else would feel uncomfortable, and I saw clearly that this wasn't love. It was labor, unpaid emotional labor assigned to me early and reinforced every time I complied, and the moment I stopped, the system didn't collapse because it was immoral. It collapsed because it was unsustainable without me propping it up, and that truth hurt in a very specific way because it meant I'd been valuable all along. Just not in the way I was taught to believe, and as this settled in, I started noticing how my family began rewriting the story in real time, not to understand it but to survive it. My mother telling relatives that I was having some kind of breakdown, that I'd always been sensitive, that success had gone to my head, and what fascinated me wasn't the cruelty but the consistency, how quickly she reached for narratives that absolved her of responsibility while casting me as unstable. Because if I was irrational, then her actions didn't need justification, and I saw how this tactic had worked. For decades, how often I'd internalized it, questioning my reactions instead of their behavior. And once you see that pattern, you can't unsee it. It's like recognizing a magician's trick, and suddenly the illusion stops working. And the more distance I took, the clearer it became that reconciliation wasn't being sought. Compliance was. They didn't want understanding. They wanted restoration of the old dynamic where I absorbed discomfort so others didn't have to, and I knew then that any conversation framed around peace or forgiveness would simply be another attempt to reinstall that role, and I wasn't willing to do it anymore. And somewhere in the middle of this clarity, my mother sent a message that at first glance seemed conciliatory, something about wanting to talk, wanting to heal, but the wording was revealing. She said, "We need to move past this, not I'm sorry, not I understand, just move past." Like the problem was my refusal to forget rather than her decision to harm, and that's when I understood something crucial. That closure doesn't come from conversations with people who refuse accountability. It comes from choosing not to re-enter cycles that drain you, and I didn't respond, not out of spite but out of self-preservation. And that choice created another ripple, one I hadn't anticipated, because suddenly people started reaching out differently, not to pressure me but to confide in me. Cousins admitting they'd always felt lesser, an aunt whispering that she admired what I did but couldn't do it herself. Even a family friend quietly acknowledging that my mother had a pattern of favoritism everyone tiptoed around. And it struck me how often truth stays hidden not because it's unknown but because no one wants to be the first to say it out loud. And once someone does, the silence breaks. And that realization was both validating and infuriating because it meant I'd carried shame that was never mine to begin with. And in those moments I felt a strange sense of responsibility. Not to fix anything, but to remain grounded in my choice, because retreating now would teach everyone watching that boundaries are negotiable if enough pressure is applied. And I wasn't willing to model that anymore. And as the days turned into weeks, something unexpected happened. The anger I thought I'd feel never fully arrived. Instead, there was grief, deep and quiet. Not for what I lost, but for what never existed. The parents I wished I had. The sister I hoped would choose differently. The family I kept trying to earn instead of expecting to simply belong to, and grieving that was necessary, because you can't heal from something you keep pretending might still materialize, and I let myself feel it fully, without minimizing it, without rushing through it, and that process stripped away the last remnants of obligation, because obligation feeds on hope, and once hope transforms into acceptance, the leverage disappears. And during this time, I also noticed how my life began expanding in small but meaningful ways. My sleep improved, my shoulders relaxed, decisions felt lighter because they weren't filtered through the question of how they'd be perceived, and even mundane moments felt different, like I was inhabiting my own life rather than auditioning for approval. And I thought about how many people live their entire lives in that audition, constantly adjusting the performance, terrified of being written out of a script they never agreed to. And I knew this story wasn't just mine, it was painfully common, especially in families where love is conditional and hierarchy is disguised as tradition. And somewhere in the middle of this newfound calm, my sister reached out, not with anger this time, but with something else, fear. She said she felt caught, that things were tense, that she didn't know how to navigate the fallout. And I listened, really listened, because compassion doesn't require self-betrayal. And I realized that while she was uncomfortable now, she still hadn't taken responsibility for her role. She talked about stress and pressure and expectations, but not about choice, not about complicity, and that told me everything I needed to know, that she was still prioritizing comfort over integrity, and I told her gently that I wasn't available to help her manage consequences I didn't create, and that conversation ended quietly, without drama, but it marked another shift because for the first time, I wasn't trying to save her from discomfort, and that was new for both of us. And after that call, I sat with a question that kept surfacing. What does a relationship look like when it's not built on obligation? And the answer was unsettling because it meant some relationships wouldn't survive the transition. And I made peace with that because loss is inevitable when you stop abandoning yourself. And I want to pause here and ask you, have you ever been positioned as the fixer in your family, the one expected to smooth things over no matter the cost? And if you stopped, what do you think would actually happen? Because I spent years believing chaos would follow, but what followed instead was exposure, truth, and a reordering that no longer centered me as the sacrifice. And as this part of my life settled into a new normal, I realized the reckoning wasn't about confrontation anymore. It was about maintenance, holding the line when guilt resurfaced, resisting the urge to explain myself to people committed to misunderstanding me, and trusting that discomfort doesn't mean I'm doing something wrong. It often means I'm doing something different, and that difference threatened systems that depended on my silence. And I knew the next test wouldn't come from a dramatic event, but from a subtle invitation, a holiday, a birthday, a request framed as an olive branch but rooted in denial. And how I responded to that would determine whether this was a momentary rebellion or a permanent shift. And that moment was closer than I realized, because the calendar was moving towards something my family had always treated as sacred, a gathering designed to reinforce togetherness. And soon I would have to decide whether showing up meant progress or regression, and whether absence could sometimes be the most honest presence of all. The invitation arrived exactly the way I knew it would, not as an apology and not as a demand, but as something dressed up to look reasonable, a neutral-sounding message from my mother that read, "We're having a small family gathering next month, and it would mean a lot if you came." No acknowledgement of what happened, no recognition of the damage, just an assumption that time had done the work she refused to do herself. And I stared at that sentence longer than I should have, because 10 years ago, I would have felt relief, gratitude even, that the door was being cracked open again, but now all I felt was caution, the kind that comes from finally understanding how traps are baited, because this wasn't reconciliation, it was a test, a quiet attempt to see if I would step back into my old role without forcing them to admit anything uncomfortable. And what made it even clearer was what wasn't said. There was no mention of boundaries, no curiosity about how I'd been, no accountability, just a calendar date and an expectation. And I realized then that the reckoning phase people talk about isn't loud or dramatic. It's subtle. It's choosing not to mistake access for change. And that choice terrified me more than confrontation ever had, because it meant saying no without being angry enough to justify it. Saying no from a place of calm clarity, which leaves no room for theatrics or excuses. And I sat with that for days, noticing how my body reacted every time I imagined going. The tightness in my chest, the old familiar scanning of potential conversations, rehearsing responses, preemptively minimizing myself. And that alone told me the answer, because healing doesn't require rehearsals. And the more I thought about it, the more I saw how my family relied on these gatherings to reset the hierarchy, to reestablish who belonged where, who could speak, and who should smile politely, and showing up would signal agreement, not peace. And I wasn't willing to sign that contract again. So I replied with a sentence that felt almost radical in its simplicity. "Thank you for the invitation, but I won't be attending. I wish you well." And I sent it before I could overthink it, before guilt could sneak in and start negotiating on my behalf. And the silence that followed was immediate and telling. No follow-up questions, no attempts to understand. Just a void that confirmed I'd done the right thing. Because people who care about connection don't respond to boundaries with disappearance unless their leverage depended on your compliance. And over the next few days, the indirect responses started arriving. A cousin texting to say mom is really hurt. An aunt asking if I couldn't just go to keep the peace. That phrase, keep the peace, always amused me because it never referred to my peace, only theirs. And I noticed how quickly the narrative shifted from what was done to me to how my absence was affecting everyone else, as if my role in the family was to absorb discomfort indefinitely so no one else had to confront reality. And that realization brought a strange sense of power, not because I enjoyed causing discomfort, but because I finally understood the value of my presence, how much energy it took to maintain the illusion of harmony, and how disruptive it was when I withdrew it. And instead of rushing to fix that disruption, I let it sit, I let them feel it. Because growth doesn't happen in comfort, it happens when familiar strategies stop working. And during this time, something else shifted. My inner dialogue changed. I stopped asking, am I being too harsh, and started asking, am I being honest? And that question reframed everything, because honesty doesn't always look kind in systems built on denial, and that doesn't make it wrong. And as weeks passed without contact, I began to see my family dynamic with almost clinical clarity. The golden child protected at all costs. The enabler maintaining balance through silence, the scapegoat. Absorbing blame and tension. And once you see those roles, you realize they're not personal. They're structural. They exist to preserve the system, not to nurture the people within it. And understanding that was liberating because it removed the last trace of self-blame. I hadn't failed at being loved. I'd succeeded at being useful until I stopped, and that success came at a cost I was no longer willing to pay. And I started investing that energy elsewhere, in friendships that felt reciprocal, in work that recognized my contributions without conditions, in routines that grounded me instead of draining me. And the contrast was stark, because healthy relationships don't require you to disappear to be tolerated. They expand when you show up fully. And I thought about how many people watching this right now might be living in families that demand constant self-editing, where love feels like a performance review, and belonging is contingent on obedience. And if that's you, I want you to pause for a second and tell me where you're watching from, not because it changes the story, but because it reminds you that you're not alone in it. There are people everywhere navigating the same invisible battles. And as this new chapter settled in, my mother finally broke the silence, not with reflection, but with escalation, a long message listing everything she'd ever done for me. Every sacrifice, every obligation I should be grateful for, and reading it felt surreal, because it confirmed everything I'd already understood. She saw parenting as a ledger, love as a transaction, and my refusal to comply as a breach of contract, and I didn't respond. Not because I had nothing to say, but because nothing I said would change her perspective. And that's another hard truth people don't talk about. Sometimes closure comes from accepting that understanding will never be mutual, and that doesn't invalidate your experience. It simply clarifies your next steps, and my next step was distance. Not as punishment, but as protection. And with that distance came an unexpected lightness, a sense of spaciousness I hadn't felt before, like I'd been holding my breath my entire life and only just realized it. And the more settled I became, the more my family seemed to unravel without my stabilizing presence. Conflict surfaced that I'd previously absorbed. Tensions between my parents and my sister intensified now that there was no buffer, no one translating emotions or smoothing edges. And while part of me felt sad witnessing that from afar, another part recognized it as necessary. Systems don't heal by maintaining the status quo. They heal by confronting the consequences of their own design. And one evening I received a message from my father that was different from the rest. Not defensive or demanding, but uncertain. He said he didn't know how to fix things and that the house felt different now, quieter, heavier. And I read that line over and over because it revealed something important. My absence hadn't created the problem, it had revealed it, and I replied honestly. I said I didn't know how to fix it either, and that I wasn't willing to return to being the solution at the expense of myself. And that was the most compassionate response I could offer, because rescuing them again would only delay the reckoning they needed to face. And after that conversation, I felt a strange sense of completion, not because everything was resolved, but because my role was, I'd stepped out of the triangle, removed myself from the pattern, and whatever happened next would happen without me as the sacrifice. And that's when I understood the true consequence of betrayal isn't anger, it's clarity. Clarity about who people are when you stop accommodating them. Clarity about what love looks like when it's no longer confused with obligation, and clarity about your own worth independent of anyone else's approval. And this clarity changes how you move through the world, how you choose relationships, how you respond to guilt, how you define loyalty. And as I stood in this new understanding, I realized the story wasn't building toward a dramatic showdown or a tearful reconciliation. It was building towards something quieter, but more profound, a moment where I would be asked to choose between nostalgia and self-respect, between familiarity and growth. And that moment was coming sooner than expected, because sometimes when you finally step out of line, the system makes one last attempt to pull you back in, not with force, but with something that looks like hope. And the next message I received suggested exactly that, an offer framed as change, but rooted in convenience. And deciding how to respond to it would test everything I'd learned so far, because this time, the cost of saying yes wouldn't just be discomfort, It would be everything I'd rebuilt, and knowing that made the choice clear even before I finished reading it. But the way it arrived and who it came from added a layer I hadn't anticipated, one that would force me to confront not just my family but my own lingering doubts. And that's where things took a turn I didn't expect at all. The message that changed everything didn't come from my parents or my sister, and that's what made it land harder. It came from my aunt, the one everyone quietly listens to at family events, the one who never raises her voice but somehow always knows what's going on. And her text was short and deceptively gentle. She said, "I think it's time you know the full story. Can we talk?" And the moment I read that, my stomach dropped because I knew instinctively that this wasn't about smoothing things over. This was about revealing something that had been hidden on purpose, something that explained not just the wedding but the years leading up to it. And we met 2 days later at a quiet cafe halfway between our neighborhoods, neutral ground, the kind of place where no one feels like they're on home turf. And before she even ordered her coffee, she looked at me and said, "I need you to listen without interrupting, because once I say this, it can't be unsaid." And I nodded, bracing myself. And then she told me what no one ever had, that the favoritism wasn't accidental. It wasn't just personality clashes or misunderstandings. It was strategic, deliberate, and rooted in a decision my parents made when I was still a teenager. A decision to quietly write me off as the child who wouldn't elevate the family, who wouldn't bring status or connections, and to invest everything into my sister instead. Not because she was better, but because she fit the image they wanted to project. And hearing that out loud felt like having the final piece of a puzzle slammed into place. Suddenly, every moment made sense. Every dismissal, every excuse, every time I was asked to compromise or step aside for the sake of appearances, it wasn't neglect, it was prioritization. And the most painful part wasn't the decision itself, but how calmly it had been executed, how normal they'd made it feel, how they'd let me internalize it as a personal failure rather than a calculated choice. And my aunt went on, explaining that the wedding incident wasn't a one-off humiliation. It was the culmination of years of positioning, that my presence threatened the narrative they'd built, the polished story of success and upward mobility, and limiting my access wasn't about logistics, it was about control, about making sure I didn't exist in spaces where I contradicted their version of reality. And as she spoke, I felt a strange mix of grief and relief. Grief for the child who tried so hard to earn love that was never on offer, and relief that I could finally stop wondering what I'd done wrong, because the answer was nothing. I'd simply existed outside their plan. And that realization unlocked a different kind of anger, not explosive or reactive, but sharp and focused, the kind that cuts through self-doubt. And I asked her why she was telling me now, why after all this time, and she looked down at her cup and said, "Because they're scared. Because when you walked away, you didn't just embarrass them, you destabilized them, and now they're scrambling to regain control." And I realized then that the invitation, the guilt messages, the sudden concern were all attempts to pull me back into a role I no longer fit. And that knowledge shifted the power dynamic entirely, because you can't unknow manipulation once it's been named. And leaving that cafe, I felt something close to resolve, not closure, but readiness. Because I understood that whatever came next would be an escalation, not reconciliation, and I wasn't going to be caught off guard again. And sure enough, the escalation came quickly. My parents reached out together this time, not individually, not through intermediaries, but as a united front, asking to meet in person, saying there were things they needed to explain, and the phrasing was careful, rehearsed, full of language about misunderstanding and family unity. And I almost declined outright, but then I realized something important. This wasn't about giving them another chance. It was about giving myself a final opportunity to speak without shrinking, to see them clearly without hoping they'd change. And we met in their living room, the same room where family photos line the walls, photos where I was either absent or positioned at the edge. And sitting across from them, I noticed how tense they looked, how my mother kept adjusting her necklace and my father avoided eye contact. And they started with apologies that weren't apologies, saying they were sorry I felt hurt, sorry things had gotten out of hand, sorry for the stress everyone was under. And I listened without reacting, because I'd learned that interruptions give people something to push against. Silence makes them reveal themselves. And eventually my mother said what she'd come to say, that the wedding was complicated, that there were expectations, that they did what they thought was best for everyone. And I asked calmly, best for who? And the room went quiet. And in that silence, I felt the weight of years lift. Because for once I wasn't rushing to fill it, wasn't offering them an exit, and my father finally spoke, saying they never meant to make me feel less than, and I responded with the truth, that intent doesn't erase impact, that love that requires invisibility isn't love, and that I wasn't interested in being reintegrated into a system that only valued me when I stayed small. And my mother tried to pivot, suggesting family therapy, shared holidays, gradual rebuilding, and I saw the pattern clearly. They wanted the outcome without the accountability, the appearance of repair without the discomfort of change. And I said no, not because I was angry, but because I was done negotiating my worth, and I explained my boundaries plainly, that I wouldn't attend events where I was treated as secondary, that I wouldn't accept conditional inclusion, that any relationship going forward would require acknowledgement of what happened and a willingness to sit with the consequences. And as I spoke, I noticed something unexpected. They were listening, not agreeing, but listening, because for the first time my absence had shown them what life looked like without my emotional labor. And that was uncomfortable. And my mother asked quietly, what happens if we can't do that? And I answered honestly, then we won't have a relationship. And that's not a threat, it's a reality. And saying those words felt like crossing a threshold, because I wasn't trying to hurt them or punish them. I was stating a fact. And when I left that house, I didn't feel victorious or devastated. I felt steady, like someone who'd finally stopped arguing with gravity. And in the weeks that followed, the fallout was uneven. My sister reached out sporadically, oscillating between defensiveness and guilt. My father sent a few tentative messages trying to maintain some connection. My mother went silent again, and through it all I stayed consistent, not cold but clear. And consistency is what people who benefit from chaos struggle with the most, because they can't negotiate with it. And during this time, something else happened, something I hadn't anticipated. People outside my family started showing up in ways I wasn't used to. Friends checked in, colleagues celebrated my milestones, acquaintances shared their own stories of family betrayal and boundaries. And I realized how much space had been freed up by stepping away from dysfunction, how much energy I'd been pouring into people who couldn't return it. And if you're listening to this and feeling that familiar tug of guilt, that voice telling you you're being selfish or dramatic, I want you to pause and ask yourself a question. Does this relationship require me to disappear to survive? And if the answer is yes, then it's not love, it's compliance. And somewhere in the middle of all this growth, I received one last message. Not from my parents, but from my sister, asking to meet alone, no agenda, just us. And I didn't know whether it would be a turning point or another attempt to rewrite history, but I agreed because I'd learned that my strength no longer depended on the outcome. And when we sat across from each other, she finally said something real. She admitted she'd known about the seating decision, that she'd let it happen because confronting it would have complicated her life. And hearing that hurt, but it didn't shatter me, because I'd already grieved the illusion of sisterhood. And I told her that honesty mattered more than apologies, that acknowledging harm was the first step toward anything resembling trust. And she asked what I needed from her now. And I told her the truth: consistency, respect, and time, not promises, not grand gestures, just different behavior over time. And she nodded, not defensively, not tearfully, just quietly. And as we parted, I felt a strange sense of completion. Not because everything was fixed, but because everything was finally named, and naming the truth removes its power to haunt you. And as I walked away, I understood that the story wasn't about revenge in the way people expect. It wasn't about humiliating them or winning some moral victory. It was about reclaiming myself from a narrative that never included me, and the final act of that reclamation was coming, not through confrontation, but through choice. A choice that would permanently redefine where I stood and who I stood with. And making that choice would change not just my relationship with my family, but my relationship with myself. And that's where this all leads, to a moment where the past loses its grip and the future becomes something you actively build. And what that moment looked like and how it unfolded is something I didn't see coming at all. Because sometimes the most powerful endings don't feel like endings. They feel like beginnings you almost didn't recognize. The moment that finally closed the loop didn't arrive with a dramatic confrontation or a teary apology. It arrived quietly on an ordinary Tuesday evening when I was sitting alone in my apartment, scrolling through my phone without really looking at anything, and I realized something unsettling and liberating at the same time. Nobody had contacted me all day. Not my parents, not my sister, not even extended family. And instead of feeling anxious or abandoned, I felt calm, deeply calm, the kind of calm that only comes when your nervous system realizes it's no longer under threat. And that was when it hit me that the real ending of this story wasn't about them at all. It was about the moment their absence stopped feeling like punishment and started feeling like peace, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for a reaction, an apology, or permission to move forward. I already had what I needed. And that realization reframed everything that had happened. The wedding, the downgrade, the gift table, the confrontation. All of it stopped being the climax and became the catalyst, the event that forced the truth into daylight, so I could finally see it without distortion. And once you see something clearly, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to negotiating with people who only show up when it benefits them. And in the weeks that followed, I noticed subtle but powerful shifts in myself. I stopped over-explaining, stopped softening my words to protect other people's comfort, stopped volunteering information that could be used against me later, and it wasn't bitterness driving those changes, it was discernment. The understanding that access to me was no longer automatic just because someone shared my last name, and that boundary alone changed the way people interacted with me. Some pulled away entirely, which told me everything I needed to know. Others adjusted, slowly and awkwardly, because they were used to a version of me that absorbed discomfort, so they didn't have to, and I no longer played that role. And then something unexpected happened. My parents tried one last maneuver, not a confrontation, not an apology, but a reframe. They sent a message suggesting a fresh start. No revisiting the past, no assigning blame, just moving forward as a family. And if this sounds familiar to you, it's because it's one of the most common tactics used when accountability feels too threatening. The idea that healing means pretending nothing happened. And for a brief moment, I considered it. Not because I missed them, but because old conditioning is hard to kill. The part of me that had spent years trying to earn peace wanted to believe that compromise was still possible. But then I asked myself a question that changed everything. Would this fresh start require me to forget what I now know? And the answer was yes. It would require me to minimize, to swallow, to resume my old position quietly. And I understood then that acceptance without truth isn't reconciliation, it's erasure. And I responded with clarity instead of emotion. I told them I wasn't interested in pretending, that any relationship going forward would have to be built on honesty and accountability, not avoidance, and that I was open to that if they were. And their silence after that message was my answer, because people who benefit from imbalance rarely choose equality when it costs them something, and that silence didn't hurt the way it once would have. It felt final in a clean, uncomplicated way. And I want to pause here and ask you something directly, because if you're still listening this far, it's probably because parts of this story feel uncomfortably familiar. Have you ever noticed how the people who demand loyalty the loudest are often the least loyal themselves? How family loyalty is preached most aggressively when someone is trying to avoid accountability? That's not an accident. Loyalty without mutual respect is just obedience dressed up as virtue. And once I understood that, I stopped framing my choices as betrayal and started seeing them as self-respect. And that shift changed the way I moved through the world. Opportunities I'd been too distracted to notice started appearing. Relationships deepened because I was finally present instead of preoccupied with managing family tension. Even my work improved because I wasn't carrying emotional weight that didn't belong to me. And then one afternoon I ran into someone who used to know my family well, an old family friend who hadn't been invited to the wedding, and she said something that stayed with me. She said, "I heard what happened, and I just want you to know a lot of us saw it coming." And when I asked what she meant, she explained that my parents had a reputation for aligning themselves with status over substance, that people had noticed how differently they treated their daughters, and that the wedding incident had only made visible what many already suspected. And hearing that was strangely validating, not because I needed public opinion on my side, but because it confirmed that I hadn't imagined the imbalance. It had been visible to others all along, and that led me to a realization that might be the most important one of all. Abusers of power rely on isolation. They thrive when you believe you're alone in your experience, when you think no one else sees what's happening, because isolation keeps you quiet. But the moment the truth is spoken, even quietly, that power weakens. And I started sharing my story selectively, not for sympathy, but for connection. And every time I did, someone would say "me too," or "I thought it was just my family," or "I've been struggling with something similar." And I realized that these stories resonate because they tap into a universal fear, the fear of being deemed expendable by the people who are supposed to protect you. And if you've lived with that fear long enough, you start confusing tolerance with strength, endurance with loyalty, silence with maturity. But real strength looks very different. It looks like walking away from tables where you're not fed. It looks like choosing discomfort now over lifelong resentment later. And it looks like trusting yourself even when the people who raised you tell you not to. And somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking of what happened at the wedding as something that was done to me and started seeing it as something that revealed the truth I needed to see. Because if that moment hadn't happened, I might still be negotiating scraps, still waiting for approval that was never coming, still shrinking myself to fit into rooms where I was only tolerated. And that's the uncomfortable truth about moments like these. They hurt deeply, but they also liberate completely. And the final piece of the story isn't about reconciliation or revenge, it's about agency, because the most powerful thing I did wasn't confronting them at the gift table or walking out of the reception. It was choosing a future that didn't revolve around their validation, and that choice continues every day in small but meaningful ways, in who I give my time to, in what behavior I tolerate, in how quickly I walk away from situations that feel familiar in the worst way. And I won't pretend it's easy. Grief still shows up sometimes, especially around holidays or milestones. But grief doesn't mean regret. It means you cared, and caring doesn't obligate you to stay where you're harmed. And if there's one thing I want you to take from this, it's this: being related to someone does not give them the right to diminish you. Love is not proven by how much pain you endure, and walking away from disrespect is not cruelty, it's clarity. And if you're standing at your own version of that gift table right now, holding something you worked hard for, wondering whether to give it to people who have made it clear you're optional, I hope you remember this story, not because it's dramatic, but because it's honest, because choosing yourself will always feel radical in families that benefit from your silence. And that discomfort you feel when you imagine setting boundaries is not a sign you're wrong. It's a sign you're changing, and change always threatens systems built on imbalance. So, if this resonated with you, if it stirred something you've been trying not to name, I want you to tell me in the comments. Not details if you don't want to, just let me know you're here, let me know you see it too. And if you want to keep exploring these stories of quiet revenge, boundaries, and self-respect, there's another one waiting for you next. Because the moment you stop living for their approval is the moment your real life begins. And that's a story worth continuing.